Welcome to the DelDOT training series on ADA compliance. This video will introduce and discuss the different types of pedestrian connections, such as curb ramps and blended transitions.
Curbs serve the important purpose of channelizing traffic and containing the flow of drainage along the edge of the road. Unfortunately, curbs pose an accessibility barrier for people in wheelchairs. To remove that accessibility barrier, a pedestrian connection is needed.
A pedestrian connection is usually sloped to enable the change in elevation from the sidewalk level to the street level. This forms a continuous connection of the pedestrian access route from one side of the street to the other. Pedestrian connections are typically installed at roadway intersections with one pedestrian connection at each end of the crosswalk. Pedestrian connections link the sidewalk to the pedestrian street crossing, providing a continuous accessible route. They can lead people across an intersection or to parking and passenger loading zones.
There are many types of street-level pedestrian connections, but they fall into two main categories, either curb ramps or blended transitions based on the slope of the ramped segment. Curb ramps are street-level pedestrian connections with a slope segment greater than 5%. Blended transitions have a slope segment of 5% or less. This matches the maximum grade of the pedestrian access route and the grade of the adjacent crossing, blending them together. Curb ramps and blended transitions come in several varieties.
For curb ramps, the three basic types are parallel, perpendicular, and diagonal, which are defined by the orientation of the ramp segment relative to the pedestrian's direction of travel in the approach sidewalk and the adjacent street level crossing. The three basic types can be used in combination to create what is called a combination ramp. This is often done to overcome physical site constraints at locations where a single type cannot achieve an accessible pedestrian connection. Pedestrian connections are comprised of several typical elements, including a sloped or ramp segment, side flares or returned curb, a turning space, and a detectable warning surface. A ramp segment is used to transition the elevation of the pedestrian access route to the elevation of the crosswalk it serves. Flared sides or returned curbs are required when there is an elevation difference between the pedestrian connection and the abutting pedestrian circulation path. Flared sides are required where side travel is permitted. The side flares offer a safer walking surface than a return curb for locations like this. Return curbs are allowed when the grade change is not adjacent to a walkable surface, such as at a buffer strip or when utilities are present.
A turning space is the level area beyond the ramped segment. The turning space allows for a user in a wheeled mobility device to maneuver and change direction. In fact, a turning space is a required element of a pedestrian connection anywhere the pedestrian must change their primary direction of travel to enter or exit a street-level pedestrian crossing. The location of the turning space is dependent upon the layout of the pedestrian connection.
A detectable warning surface is required prior to entering the roadway. The detectable warning surface indicates the boundary between pedestrian and vehicular routes where there's a flush rather than a curbed connection. The detectable warning surface provides a tactile clue to people with visual impairments. It indicates where the sidewalk ends and the street begins.
Perpendicular curb ramps have a running slope that cuts through the curb line or is built up at approximately right angles to the curb. This approach places the curb in the street and may require safety measures to delineate the presence of the curb ramp for drivers. Building a perpendicular curb ramp into the street using curb extensions allows for the development of other public services such as on-street parking. The layout of perpendicular curb ramps requires the turning space to be located at the top of the ramped segment.
The advantages of perpendicular ramps are that they are less likely to pond and trap sediment because the turning space is at the top of the ramp segment. They can be aligned to provide directionality. This helps motorists see which direction the pedestrian intends to cross the street, increasing safety. The disadvantages of perpendicular ramps are that they require wider sidewalks, buffer strips, or curb extensions compared to parallel type ramps, and large radius corners can present directionality challenges for designers.
Parallel curb ramps have a running slope that is in line with the direction of sidewalk travel. A parallel ramp lowers the sidewalk to a level turning space at the bottom of the ramp segment. This is where users maneuver to enter the pedestrian street crossing. Parallel curb ramps are primarily used where the available right-of-way does not support the development of a perpendicular type curb ramp. They are advantageous in constrained locations and on alteration projects. The turning space on a parallel curb ramp is located at the bottom of the ramped segment.
It is not always obvious whether a curb ramp is parallel or perpendicular. The orientation of the ramp segment and the location of the turning space are key elements in defining the curb ramp type. In this example, we see a curb ramp in Rehoboth Beach where the ramp segment is built up to the curb, which may seem like a perpendicular curb ramp. But the location of the turning space at the bottom of the ramp segment gives it away as a parallel type curb ramp.
Where there is no need to change direction, no turning space is required. In this example, there is no turning space provided at the top or bottom of the ramp. The key indicator of the type of ramp this is the orientation of the ramp segment. It cuts through the curb line at approximately right angles. This gives it away as a perpendicular type curb ramp. Advantages of parallel type curb ramps are they fit within a narrow right-of-way. Parallel curb ramps can be easily lengthened when required to chase grade, and individuals with visual impairments find them easier to detect because the ramp segment leads to a turning space ahead of the street crossing.
Disadvantages of parallel curb ramps are that they require pedestrians using the sidewalk to traverse multiple ramp segments even if they are not using the crosswalk. And parallel curb ramps are more likely to accumulate water and debris because the turning space is located at the street level.
A diagonal curb ramp is a type of perpendicular curb ramp that's located at the apex of a corner radius and is designed to serve two independent street crossings. Diagonal curb ramps are termed diagonal ramps because they're oriented toward the center of the intersection and diagonal to the two crosswalks served.
The advantages of diagonal curb ramps are that they offer an accessibility improvement when other curb ramps are not feasible. The disadvantages are their alignment does not serve either crosswalk well. They are difficult to navigate as they direct the user to the center of the intersection. They are challenging to navigate for persons with visual impairments and difficult for motorists to assess which direction the pedestrian is intending to cross when approaching the intersection.
Parallel and perpendicular curb ramps can be combined to create combination type curb ramps. Combination curb ramps utilize characteristics of both parallel and perpendicular curb ramps. Combination curb ramps often use an approach parallel type curb ramp to lower the path elevation to a turning space, and then use a perpendicular ramp to bridge the remaining elevation gap between the turning space and the street. This curb ramp type is particularly useful where the sidewalk is narrow and has either a steep approach grade or a high curb.
A blended transition is the generic definition for a slope segment that lowers the sidewalk elevation to the street level with a running slope of 5% or less. They come in three varieties: ones that look like curb ramps, depressed corners, and raised street crossings.
The advantages of depressed corners are that no turning space is required unless turning movements are required. And they're better than parallel curb ramps at alleviating drainage concerns because a level turning space is not required at the bottom of the slope segment.
Depressed corners can be used at locations where there is not enough available space to construct two separate parallel or perpendicular curb ramps. They are ideal retrofit options for existing diagonal curb ramp locations where the width of the pedestrian circulation path is constrained by existing features.
The disadvantages of depressed corners are that they provide poor directionality And like diagonal curb ramps, it's difficult for motorists to determine the direction the pedestrian intends to cross the street, which could create safety issues.
The boundary between the sidewalk and the street is much more difficult to detect for persons with vision impairments. Depressed corners may encourage motorists to encroach onto the sidewalk or turn at high speeds since there is no vertical separation between the sidewalk and the street at the corner. When depressed corners are used, consideration should be given to using planters or bollards to prevent cars from traveling into the facility.
Paired perpendicular curb ramps offer a much better option for the visually impaired because boundary detection is so much easier. The slope on any required turning space is controlled by the roadway that the street-level pedestrian connection serves. This may lead to challenges for users who are not using the crosswalk.
All pedestrian connections, designed and constructed properly, will meet the requirements of the ADA. However, some layouts provide more desirable characteristics than others. All proposed locations should be analyzed individually to determine which pedestrian connection type is most suitable.
It is recommended to physically separate paired perpendicular curb ramps through use of a curb or other detectable features, such as a grass buffer. The department's preference is to always provide separate street-level pedestrian connections for each pedestrian street crossing. The separation distance of paired parallel curb ramps should be a minimum of 4 feet. Here we see a much greater separation distance. The department prefers the use of perpendicular type curb ramps. However, parallel curb ramps are the preferred treatment at the following locations: constrained locations that preclude the ability to construct perpendicular type curb ramps, and locations where a steep approach will require a 15-foot ramp segment to avoid chasing grade. Combination type curb ramps can also be used for this purpose.
Depressed corners are acceptable, but should be considered only after perpendicular and parallel curb ramps have been evaluated and determined not to be practical.
Diagonal and parallel curb ramps that serve multiple pedestrian street crossings shall not be used unless existing site constraints prevent the use of other street-level pedestrian connection types. Designers should only consider this approach on alteration-type projects after discussion with their supervisor and/or DelDOT's Title II coordinator.
We hope you found this video helpful in defining the importance and the different types of pedestrian connections. Please consult with DelDOT's ADA Title II coordinator for accessibility guidance on your project.